They said it was legal. They said procedure was followed. They said no rules were broken. But a man still died on a quiet street, and somehow no one was responsible. Disclaimer: this story is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by real events. Names, characters, and situations have been altered. This is not a story about a criminal. It's a story about how a system works. When no one is watching closely, the street was calm. Not the kind of calm that feels safe, but the kind that exists when nothing has gone wrong yet. The pavement still held the day's warmth. A single streetlight flickered, buzzing softly, casting long shadows that stretched and dissolved with each passing car. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. Life, continuing as usual. There were no protests that night, no raised voices, no warning signs telling people to stay away, no police tape fluttering in the wind, no chaos waiting to be explained later. Just a quiet residential street and a man walking home. His name in this story is Daniel Price, not because it appeared in headlines or was printed on banners, but because stories like this deserve a name even when the world tries to forget them. Daniel wasn't famous. No one had ever searched his name unless they already knew him. He wasn't powerful. He didn't sit in rooms where decisions were made. He didn't have a voice that carried through walls. And he wasn't armed. Daniel worked 2 jobs, one that barely paid enough, and another that stole what little time he had left. He paid his rent late more often than he liked to admit, and learned how to apologize without sounding desperate. He knew which bills could wait and which ones couldn't. He knew how to stretch groceries for 3 extra days. He knew how to walk faster at night without looking afraid. Daniel avoided trouble whenever he could. Not because he was weak, but because he learned something early on. Trouble never announces itself. It just shows up and decides who it belongs to. That night, Daniel was thinking about nothing important, the ache in his feet, whether he had enough money left to fix the flickering light in his kitchen, how quiet his phone had been lately. He didn't know that several agencies were operating nearby. Not city police, not county sheriffs. People with authority, but without familiar uniforms. People whose presence wasn't meant to be noticed until it was already too late. Their vehicles didn't draw attention. Their movements didn't announce themselves. They were trained for efficiency, not visibility. Daniel had no reason to look over his shoulder. Until he did. Footsteps. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Measured. Daniel slowed instinctively, his body reacting before his thoughts could catch up. The sound stayed behind him, steady, intentional. He turned. Faces emerged from the dark, partially lit by the streetlight overhead. Not angry. Not calm. Professional. Words were exchanged. Daniel spoke first, his voice even. The way you speak when you're trying not to escalate anything. A question, then another. Orders followed. Short. Direct. Unemotional. Daniel's hands hesitated for a moment, caught between confusion and compliance. He had nothing to hide, yet he could feel the air tightening around him all the same. Seconds passed. In moments like this, time doesn't move forward. It collapses inward. Every sound sharpens. Every movement feels louder than it should. Daniel noticed the hum of the streetlight again. The faint smell of warm asphalt. The way his heartbeat seemed to climb into his throat. Then a decision. Not debated. Not revisited. One shot. The sound cracked through the quiet street. Too loud for something meant to be controlled. Daniel felt the impact before he understood it. A sudden force that stole his breath and folded his body toward the ground. He fell. The pavement met him without ceremony. No final words, no dramatic pause, just wait. And stillness. The footsteps stopped. The streetlight kept humming, unchanged, indifferent. And the street went quiet again. By morning, the city had an explanation. It arrived quietly, without urgency, as if it had been waiting for the night to pass before stepping into the light. Typed, reviewed, approved. The words were chosen carefully. every sentence balanced, every phrase scrubbed of emotion. It was perfectly neutral. Not cold enough to sound cruel, not warm enough to sound human, just right. The incident occurred during a lawful operation. The sentence carried no weight of blood, no echo of the sound that had cracked through the street hours earlier. It did not mention where the operation had begun or why it had ended the way it did. It did not say Daniel's name. Officers acted within their authority. Authority was the key word. It stood in place of explanation. It replaced context. Authority didn't need to justify itself. It simply existed. There is no indication of wrongdoing at this time. At this time. The phrase left a door open without ever promising someone would walk through it. It suggested movement while remaining still. By the time people read the statement, the night already felt distant. The street had returned to normal. Cars passed. Lights turned on in kitchens. Morning routines resumed. No mention of fear. Not the kind that tightens the chest when unfamiliar voices speak behind you in the dark. Not the fear that makes your hands hesitate between compliance and confusion. No mention of confusion. The kind that comes when orders arrive too fast, spoken with certainty but without clarity. The kind that leaves a person wondering whether they've misunderstood something important, or whether the misunderstanding was never theirs to begin with. No mention of Daniel's last words. Whatever he may have said, a question, a protest, or nothing at all, they did not survive the transition from pavement to paperwork. They were unnecessary details. The statement moved on without them. It focused on what mattered: procedure, authority, compliance. These were facts. Everything else was interpretation. And interpretation, the city understood, was dangerous. Facts could be managed. Facts could be archived. Facts could be cited later without reopening the wound. Emotion could not. Emotion asked questions. Emotion demanded explanations. Emotion refused to stay in its designated place, so emotion was left out. The statement was released. News outlets copied it word for word. Anchors read it with practiced detachment, their voices steady, their expressions appropriately serious. They did not linger. Another segment followed. Another story replaced it. The city had spoken, and in speaking, it had drawn a boundary. On one side were events, messy, loud, irreversible. On the other side were conclusions, clean, final, and carefully contained. Legally, there was nothing to examine further. No lines crossed. No rules broken. No actions taken outside what had already been permitted. The law recognized itself in the mirror and nodded back. And legally, everything was clean. Daniel's sister, Emily, waited for answers. She waited the way people do when they don't yet understand that waiting is the only thing the system asks of them. At first, she believed there had been a mistake, a misunderstanding, a mix-up of addresses, a moment that would be corrected as soon as the right person heard the right story. Emily wasn't naive. She'd lived long enough to know the world wasn't fair. But she also believed, stubbornly, quietly, that fairness still existed somewhere behind the right door. So she knocked. She didn't ask for revenge. Not because she didn't feel it. Not because she couldn't imagine it. But because revenge was a language the system knew how to defend itself against. Revenge could be dismissed as emotion. Revenge could be framed as instability. Emily refused to give them that. She didn't demand arrests. She didn't stand outside buildings with signs. She didn't shout into cameras. She didn't name villains, because she still hoped there weren't any. She asked one question. A single word so small it could fit in the palm of a hand, so heavy it could break it. Why? Why was he stopped? Why was he confronted? Why was a decision made that no one seemed willing to own? She asked it softly at first. To people who sounded sympathetic. To officials who said they understood. To strangers who promised to look into it. She asked it again, louder, when "we'll call you back" turned into days. She asked it with a steadiness that surprised even her, as if the word itself could be a rope pulling the truth out of hiding. The response was silence. Not rude silence. No one slammed the phone down. No one laughed. No one told her she didn't matter. Not hostile silence either. Hostility would have been something, a sign of guilt, a crack in the wall. This silence was different. It was procedural. It came wrapped in courtesy. It arrived in perfectly measured tones, in phrases polished smooth like stones left too long in a river. It sounded like, "We understand your concern. We appreciate your patience. We can't comment on an ongoing review." It sounded like help, but it didn't move anything. Emails went unanswered. Not ignored in a dramatic way, not rejected with a refusal, just unanswered. As if the messages had fallen into a room where no one was assigned to hear them. Calls were redirected. She learned the rhythm of it. A person, a number, a department, a transfer tone. Another person, another number. Every voice pleasant, every voice careful. Every voice leading her to the same dead end. Statements were repeated. Always the same lines. Always the same order. She could recite them after a while, the way you memorize a prayer you no longer believe in. Emily kept a notebook on her kitchen table. Dates, times, names, or what passed for names. Some people only gave first names. Some gave titles instead. Supervisor, coordinator, public information. Words that sounded like jobs, not humans. At night, Emily would stare at the pages and wonder how something could be so documented and still feel like nothing was happening. Each response sounded polite. The politeness was almost worse. Politeness made it seem as if no one was hurting her. As if her pain had been acknowledged, processed, filed correctly. As if the system could offer condolences without offering clarity. And every polite response was empty. Not empty of words. There were plenty of words. Empty of meaning. Empty of responsibility. Empty of the one thing Emily needed most. Someone to look her in the eye and admit that a real choice had been made. She started to notice how people reacted when she said Daniel's name. Some paused, uncomfortable. Some looked away. Some offered sympathy that sounded practiced. A few spoke in whispers, as if speaking too clearly might invite consequences. Emily wasn't asking for miracles. She wasn't asking for history to reverse itself, as if speaking too clearly might invite consequences. Emily wasn't asking for miracles. She wasn't asking for history to reverse itself. She was asking for a sentence that felt human. Something like, "This is what happened. This is why we did it. This is who decided." But the system wasn't built for that. It wasn't designed to explain itself to the people it harmed. It wasn't designed to carry grief across a desk and translate it into something that made sense. It was designed to function, to move forward, to protect its own continuity. And the more Emily searched for a door, the more she realized there wasn't a door at all, just corridors. Corridors that led back into themselves. Because the system wasn't designed to explain itself to people like Emily. Neighbors whispered, not all at once, not loudly. The kind of whispers that travel sideways, sliding from one doorway to another, from one lowered voice to the next. They happened on porches, in grocery store aisles, at bus stops where people pretended to be more interested in their phones than in each other. Someone said they saw Daniel walking too fast. Someone else said he looked nervous. Someone wondered aloud why anyone would be out that late anyway. The statements didn't sound cruel. They sounded practical. Explanations people used to make sense of something unsettling without letting it come too close. Some said Daniel must have done something wrong. They didn't say it with certainty. They said it with a shrug. The way people speak when they want the world to remain predictable. Because if nothing wrong had happened, then anything could. And that thought was dangerous. Others said they heard shouting, not screaming, not pleading, just raised voices, commands maybe. But they weren't sure. They emphasized that part carefully, weren't sure. Memory, after all, is flexible. It bends to comfort. It adjusts itself to fit whatever version of events asks the least of us. Someone recalled looking out their window but seeing nothing clearly. Another remembered closing their blinds before anything happened. Details softened, edges blurred. The story lost its shape. No one wanted to be certain. Certainty is heavy. Certainty asks for witnesses. Certainty requires follow-up questions. Certainty brings responsibility. And responsibility brings consequences. Consequences are uncomfortable. They ask you to stand still when everyone else is moving forward. They ask you to repeat the same story to people who may not want to hear it. They ask you to risk being wrong, or worse, being right. So the city adjusted its posture. People went back to work. Children were walked to school. Trash bins appeared on the curb at the usual time. Life resumed with the quiet efficiency of something practiced. The street where Daniel fell was cleaned. Not dramatically, no ceremony. Just enough that nothing would catch the eye of someone passing through. Conversations shortened. The story changed shape again. It became a cautionary tale. A vague warning. A sad situation, not something to dwell on. At dinner tables, people lowered their voices. At gatherings, the subject shifted quickly. Someone would start to mention the night, then stop. Another would clear their throat and talk about something safer. Weather, traffic, local sports. The city wasn't heartless. It sent thoughts. It sent prayers. But it did not linger. Lingering would have required a pause. And pausing would have meant looking directly at what had happened. It was easier to accept that everything important had already been decided, that the right people had reviewed the facts, that the conclusions were final, because believing otherwise would mean believing that ordinary people might be asked to carry some part of the burden, and the city had places to be, bills to pay, deadlines to meet, lives that demanded attention. The story of Daniel became smaller. First a headline, then a paragraph, then a memory some people avoided naming. Eventually, it became background noise, something you almost remember until something reminds you. But reminders faded. New stories arrived. New emergencies replaced old ones. The city did not forget out of malice. It forgot out of habit. Because forgetting is a skill cities learn early. So the city did what it always does. It moved on. An independent review was announced. The words carried weight, at least at first. They suggested distance, objectivity, a promise that someone, somewhere, would look closely enough to see what others had missed. It sounded like movement. For a brief moment, it felt like progress. Then it was delayed, not canceled, not denied, just delayed. The delay was framed as necessary. Additional time, further coordination, a thorough process. No one argued against thoroughness. Thoroughness sounds responsible. Time passed. The delay became familiar. Another update promised soon. Another assurance that things were underway. Eventually, the review returned. Not with fanfare. Not with questions. With a summary, short, contained, final. The conclusion was brief. No policy violations were identified. The sentence did not explain itself. It did not describe how many policies had been reviewed, or how they were interpreted, or who had written them in the first place. It did not say what those policies were designed to protect, or who. It simply closed the door. No officer named. Names complicate things. Names invite follow-ups. Names create a path that can be traced. This review offered none. No agency blamed. Blame implies direction. It suggests a line of responsibility that can be followed from decision to consequence. But there was no single line to follow. Because jurisdiction overlapped, boundaries blurred, authorities intersected, responsibilities touched, then passed through one another. Each agency operated within its own limits. Each decision existed inside a narrow frame. Each action was technically correct within the space it occupied. And when those spaces collided, no one owned the collision. Questions bounced between departments like light between mirrors, not denied. Not answered, redirected, One office referenced another. One authority deferred to a different scope. One explanation ended exactly where the next one was supposed to begin. And so nothing truly began. The system functioned as designed, smoothly, efficiently, without friction. It protected itself not through secrecy, but through structure. Structure is harder to argue with. Structure feels neutral. Structure looks like order, but order can hide absence. Absence of responsibility. Absence of accountability. Daniel wasn't killed by one person. There was no single moment that could be isolated and pointed to as the failure. There were decisions, yes, but each decision belonged to a different box, a different chart, a different chain of command. Individually, they appeared reasonable. Collectively, they became irreversible. This was the strength of the system and its weakness. Because when power is shared without clarity, it becomes diluted. Everyone has a role. Everyone follows protocol. Everyone stays within bounds. And when something breaks, no one stands at the center of it. Daniel wasn't killed by rage. He wasn't killed by malice. He was killed by alignment, by processes that fit together too well, by authority that overlapped just enough to leave no empty space for responsibility to land. He was killed by a system where everyone had power and no one had ownership. Weeks passed, not all at once, not dramatically. They passed the way time always does when no one is watching closely, quietly, methodically, without asking permission. The news cycle changed. Another headline arrived. Another crisis demanded attention. Another story pushed its way to the front with brighter images and louder consequences. Daniel's name appeared less often. First it slipped from the opening lines, then from the headlines, then from the conversations that happened in public. Eventually, it stopped appearing altogether. But Emily still heard it. She heard it in the pause before people answered her questions. She heard it when her phone stayed silent longer than it used to. And she heard it every time the streetlight outside her window flickered. The sound was subtle, a faint hum, a brief stutter of light. Most people wouldn't notice it. Emily always did. It reminded her of the night when something had gone wrong without ever being officially acknowledged. The city didn't erase Daniel. Erasure would have required effort, intent. The city didn't tear down records or rewrite history. It simply stopped mentioning him. No reminders, no updates. No anniversaries marked. His story wasn't denied. It was outpaced. Life resumed its rhythm. People learned, unconsciously, which topics invited discomfort and which ones passed easily between smiles. Daniel's name belonged to the first category, so it was avoided. Not out of cruelty, out of convenience. Silence stepped in where words had once been, and silence did the rest. Silence is efficient. It doesn't need justification. It doesn't require agreement. Silence doesn't argue. There's no debate to win when no one is speaking. Silence doesn't accuse. It leaves no fingerprints. No record of intent, no voice to point back to its source. Silence doesn't demand reform. Reform needs pressure. Pressure needs persistence. Persistence needs memory. Silence erodes all three. In silence, responsibility diffuses. It spreads thin until it becomes abstract and easy to ignore. In silence, grief becomes private. Something carried alone, behind closed doors, without language strong enough to change anything outside them. Emily learned this slowly. She stopped checking the news as often. Not because she had given up, but because she had learned what would not be there. She still remembered the details, the date, the hour, the sound of her phone ringing. But the world around her no longer seemed obligated to remember them with her. Silence didn't arrive like a decision. It settled. It filled the spaces where questions used to live. It made itself comfortable in the absence of follow-up. And over time, it taught the city something important. That nothing bad happens when you say nothing at all. No backlash. No disruption. No accountability. Just quiet. And quiet, once established, has a way of defending itself. It convinces people that the past is settled. That what hasn't changed no longer needs attention. That remembering is optional. Silence doesn't erase the truth. It doesn't have to. It just waits until memory fades. No laws were changed. No emergency sessions were called. No revisions were drafted. No footnotes were added to the rulebook to explain what had happened. The system examined itself and found nothing missing. No officers were charged. No names were read aloud in courtrooms. No uniforms were folded away in silence. No careers ended abruptly under the weight of accountability. Everything remained intact. No one officially failed. Failure requires acknowledgement. It needs a moment where someone says, "This should not have happened." That moment never came, and yet, a man never came home. No legal language could change that fact. No conclusion could soften it. No report could reverse the absence that settled into the space he once occupied. There was an empty chair, an unanswered phone, a life that stopped without ever being formally interrupted. The city continued. The system functioned. The world adjusted around the shape of what was missing. And in that adjustment, something else quietly took place. The burden shifted, not onto a person, not onto a department, onto memory, onto those who remembered and wondered whether remembering was itself a kind of resistance. So here's the question this story leaves behind. Not a question meant for courtrooms, not one designed to assign guilt. A question that lingers, only because it has no official place to land. When a system can take a life without breaking a single rule, dung tu gai, is the problem the people inside it? The individuals following orders, the ones trained to comply, the ones acting within the boundaries they were given? Or the silence that protects it, the silence that smooths edges, the silence that calls itself neutrality, the silence that waits patiently for outrage to expire, because silence doesn't need justification. It doesn't file reports, it doesn't write statements, it doesn't appear in reviews. It simply remains long enough for everything else to fade around it. And when nothing challenges it, silence begins to look like resolution. The story doesn't end with justice. It ends with a pause. A space left open for anyone still listening to decide what matters more. Rules that never bend or lives that cannot be replaced fade to black. Silence doesn't pull the trigger. It just makes sure no one answers for it.